Rogers. Rogers and the leader of the expedition, William Dampier. Dampier lived in the latter part of the 17th century, long before Cooper. So William Dampier talked about, and William Dampier and Rogers picked up Alexander Selkirk from that island after he had stayed there for 5 long years. On returning to England, Alexander Selkirk, a man from Fife, narrated his story to the well-known figure called Steele, the essayist. You remember Addison and Steele are famous essayists in the early part of 18th century during the reign of Queen Anne, during the Augustan period. So, Steele narrated the story of Alexander Selkirk in his The Englishman. If you want to pursue it further, you could read the issue of the 13th of December 1713 to find out what Steele had to say. Thereafter begins an interesting story, a minor story in English literature, but an interesting one, a relevant one, a significant one, because after him, Daniel Defoe based his novel called Robinson Crusoe, which you must have read, on the story of Alexander Selkirk. And here, in this poem, William Cooper writes about Alexander Selkirk. I'll read out those 4 interesting lines once again. O solitude, where are the charms that sages have seen in thy face? Better dwell in the midst of alarms than reign in this horrible place. Alexander Selkirk was monarch of that island called Juan Fernandez. But that monarchy was not worth a tuppence compared with living in a city like London, which is full of people, where he was just a man among men, just an ordinary person, and still the life that Alexander Selkirk lived in London was much more interesting, much more fruitful, much more rewarding than the life in that horrible island, to use Cooper's words. William Cooper was not a great poet. His poetry will admit respect, but not warmth of feeling. He is often read. For instance, late in his life, he was told in one of his periods of depression, I'll tell you about his life briefly very soon. In one of his periods of depression, he was entertained by one Anna Austen, not to be confused with the novelist Jane Austen. Anna Austen told him about one John Gilpin. And this story of John Gilpin, which incidentally Cooper heard in one of the periods of depression, which you also must have read as a young child in your book of nursery rhymes. John Gilpin has been has a favorite poem for people preparing anthologies for children, and I am quite sure that you must have read one of them as a child. I'll remind you about the poem, lest you should have forgotten it, by reciting a few lines from this entertaining, and the title that William Cooper gave it was The Diverting History of John Gilpin. It was written in 1782. John Gilpin was a citizen of credit and renown. John Gilpin was a citizen of credit and renown. A train band captain eke was he of famous London town. John Gilpin's spouse said to her dear, Though wedded we have been, these twice 10 tedious years, yet we no holiday have seen. Tomorrow is our wedding day, and we will then repair unto the bell at Edmonton, all in a chaise and pair. And then she narrates, Mrs. Gilpin narrates that she would be going, and her sister would be going, and her maid would be going, and the 2 children would be going. So there won't be space for them in the chaise. So Gilpin had to take a horse from one Mr. Callender. And Gilpin was probably riding the horse for the first time in his life. And he mounted the horse but did not know how to get off. So the horse left his place, his shop, until it reached Callender's house, by which time he had lost his cap, he had broken his bottles of wine which his wife had prepared, and they were carrying for the picnic. And after he reached there, then once again, his master, the horse's master, Callender, helped him with a cap, too big for his head, of course, and a coat, and in the hope that this time he would be able to reach the inn and dismount there, he once again rode the horse and once again lost control over the horse until it reached his shop. And that was the history. That was the history of John Gilpin's holiday on his wedding day. So that is the kind of history that he wrote. And it was immensely popular, as you would expect. What is to be remembered is that Cooper did not like the poem very much himself, because he wanted to be seen as a serious poet. He did not want to be seen as a rhymester. He did not want to be seen as a writer of nursery rhymes for children. So he was not very happy with this poem, since it was very popular and since he got to be known by this poem late in his life, in 1782. You remember, in 8 years' time he was about to die. So late in his life, he published a famous poem suggested once again by this Miss Austen. In his depressions, Cooper had a happy opportunity of being nursed and looked after by at least 2 women. One was Mary Unwin and the other was Miss Austen. Lady Austen took care of him for only 3 years, and Mary Unwin, on whom he has written quite a few poems actually, and some of them very good, because considering the fact that Cooper is considered a minor poet, some of his lines on Mary Unwin are actually great. One of them has been anthologized in Palgrave's Golden Treasury, and I'm going to read out a few lines from this poem to Mary Unwin. Mary, I want a lyre with other strings, such aid from heaven as some have feigned they drew, an eloquence scarce given to mortals, new and undebased by praise of meaner things. Mary, I want a lyre with other strings, such aid from heaven as some have feigned they drew, an eloquence scarce given to mortals, new and undebased by praise of meaner things. Cooper wanted to be a great poet, but he developed as a great poet not until the age of 50. Before that, he tried his hand at other things. Cooper was born at the rectory of Berkhamsted. His father, Reverend John Cooper, was a rector of Berkhamsted. Berkhamsted is northwest of London. if you look at the map of England, in the southern part you have London, and northwest of London, not very far away from London, you have Berkhamsted. And he was born at Berkhamsted. In those days, it must have appeared pretty far away from London, because they had to hire a chaise to reach there. So, but when he was of the age of 6, his mother died. And somehow it appears that he was not a favorite child of his father. He left his home, and we do not hear of his ever living at the rectory with his father until he was 18 years old. And even then he was with his father just for a few months, for less than a year. We don't know. His biographers are not very sure about the reasons for his living away from home. And that must have been one of the important factors that led to his lifelong pessimism, depression, as we would call it today. Dejection is the word that they used in the 18th century and early in the 19th century. You would remember the words of Coleridge, the poem of Coleridge, Dejection and Ode. Coleridge also suffered from this problem, and Cooper suffered from this problem, and it was a very bad condition in which he lived during the last few years of his life, because Mary Unwin died a few years before him, around 1796, and for about 4 years we don't know how Cooper lived. He had a very painful life. Late in his life, once again in the 80s it appears, a lady called Anna Bodham sent him a picture of his mother, and he replied to her, "I received it the night before last." He is talking about, that is, Cooper is talking about the picture of his mother that he received from Anna Bodham. "I received it the night before last, and viewed it with a trepidation of nerves and spirits somewhat akin to what I should have felt had the dear original presented herself to my embraces. I kissed it, and hung it where it is, the last object that I see at night, and of course the first on which I open my eyes in the morning." This would give you some impression of the kind of loneliness that Cooper was suffering from. No one who has an active life would tend to suffer from this kind of fixation that Cooper shows in these lines to Mrs. Anna Bodham, who sent her the picture. He wrote a fairly long poem on the title of this poem is "On the Receipt of My Mother's Picture." It begins, "Oh, that those lips had language. Oh, that those lips had language. Life has passed with me but roughly since I heard thee last. Those lips are thine, thy own sweet smile I see, the same that oft in childhood solaced me." His mother died when he was 6, and he remembers the solace that he received from his mother, probably because there was nothing to replace it. There was no love and affection from his father that he could have smudged off the memory of his mother. It goes on, and it says, "I heard the bell tolled on thy burial day." He's remembering the day on which his mother died. "I heard the bell tolled on thy burial day. I saw the hearse that bore thee slow away, and turning from my nursery window drew a long, long sigh and wept a last adieu. But was it such? It was, where thou art gone. Adieus and farewells are a sound unknown. May I but meet thee on that peaceful shore, the parting word shall pass my lips no more. Thy maidens grieved themselves at my concern, oft gave me promise of thy quick return. What ardently I wished, I long believed, and disappointed still, was still deceived. By expectation every day beguiled. By expectation every day beguiled. He, as a child, remembered and thought that his mother would come, and he hoped every day that she would come the next day, and he was beguiled, deceived by this expectation. Oft gave me promise of thy quick return. What ardently I wished, I long believed, and disappointed still, was still deceived. By expectation every day beguiled, due of tomorrow, even from a child. Thus many a sad tomorrow came and went, till all my stock of infant sorrows spent. I learned at last submission to my lot, but though I less deplored thee, never forgot. But though I less deplored thee, never forgot. After leaving the rectory of Berkhamsted, he went to a school run by one Dr. Pittman in the Market Street on the borders of Herefordshire. Herefordshire, you would remember, is written as Hertford, Hereford, Shire, shire, Herefordshire. It's pronounced as Hereford, but written Hertford. So, there he continued for 2 years, but his stay there was embittered by one of the students, as he narrates, whom he did not have the courage to see above his knees. He recognized him by his shoe buckles. So, from the beginning, Cooper was a shy and timid child. He was unable to cope with other people, with difficult situations. Thereafter, he developed some problem with his eye, and he went to live with an oculist in London for 2 years. And his eyesight improved, but his eyesight improved much better still later when he suffered from chickenpox. So the chickenpox came as a curative disease for his eyesight. Thereafter, he went to Westminster School. At Westminster, he was a friend of Warren Hastings, the future Lord Warren Hastings of India. And he wrote about him in one of his a short poem on him, a few lines on him, which you might like to hear. To Warren Hastings, Squire, he says, by an old schoolfellow of his at Westminster. Hastings, I knew thee young and of a mind, while young, humane, conversable and kind, nor can I well believe thee gentle then, now grown a villain. You remember, Warren Hastings was impeached. There was a motion in the Parliament, in the British Parliament, to impeach Warren Hastings, and there were many charges against him for the hanging of Raja Nand Kumar, for instance. Now grown a villain and the worst of men. That's why he says, nor can I well believe thee gentle then, nor now grown a villain and the worst of men, but rather some suspect who have oppressed and worried thee as not themselves the best. So it's a kind of a few lines on a friend whose memory he is, as part of a social obligation, he finds it necessary to discharge. But these are not passionate lines, these are not warm lines. No warmth of feeling towards Warren Hastings comes out of these lines, and they would not be remembered so much as, for instance, his lines on Dr. Johnson. Dr. Johnson died in 1784, and in January 1785, Cooper wrote, this was meant to be an epitaph on him. Here Johnson lies, a sage by all allowed, whom to have bred may well make England proud, whose prose was eloquence by wisdom taught, the graceful vehicle of virtuous thought, whose verse may claim grave, masculine and strong, whose verse may claim grave, masculine and strong. Johnson wrote The Vanity of Human Wishes, and before that, London. So these are two great poems of Samuel Johnson. Whose verse may claim grave, masculine and strong, superior praise to the mere poet's song, who many a noble gift from heaven possessed, and faith at last alone worth all the rest. A man, O man, immortal by a double prize, by fame on earth, by glory in the skies. The subject of Dr. Johnson elicits the respect, the regard that exudes from these lines of William Cooper. You notice how the subject influences the style of a poem, the style of writing. This is a subtle point that should not be forgotten. Cooper remembers Johnson for being one of the great prose writers, whose prose was eloquence by wisdom taught, Before becoming a poet, Cooper was a great prose writer. Let me read out his memory of one Vinnie Bourne. He was one of his teachers at Westminster, where William Cooper knew Warren Hastings, as you already know. He writes about Vinnie Bourne. I love the memory of Vinnie Bourne. I think him a better Latin poet than Tibullus, Propertius, Ausonius, or any of the writers in his way, except Ovid, and not at all inferior to him. I love him too with a love of partiality, because he was usher of the fifth form in Westminster when I passed through it. Cooper is remembering one of his teachers, Vinnie Bourne. He was so good-natured and so indolent. That I lost more than I got by him, for he made me as idle as himself. We don't know whether Cooper became idle because of Vinnie Bourne or because of the neglect that he faced early in his life, or because there was something wrong with his nervous system which brought about the loss of nerve to him. Whatever the reason, Cooper thought that part of his idleness was because of Vinnie Bourne. He says, I lost more than I got by him, for he made me as idle as himself. He was such a sloven, as if he had trusted to his genius a cloak of everything that would disgust you in his person. Vinnie Bourne must have been conscious of his learning, and he thought that people would respect his learning and would not mind his slovenliness, his dirty clothes. He was such a sloven, as if he had trusted to his genius as a cloak for everything that could disgust you in his person, and indeed in his writings he has almost made amends for all. His humor is entirely original. He can speak of a magpie or a cat in terms so exquisitely appropriated to the character he draws that one would suppose him animated by the spirit of the creature he describes. Cowpe, this goes on quite over more than half a page, but I would stop here. You should, if you can find a volume of Cowpe's letters, you must read them. So Cowpe here describes, he praises Winnie Bourne for his description of animals. I am reminded of Cowpe's own description of his rabbit, a hare which had left its cage and run away from home, and how it was chased and how it was caught. It is too tempting to leave it aside. He wrote to one Reverend John Newton. Let me tell you a little bit about Reverend John Newton. Reverend John Newton is an important figure, is an important minor figure in English literature, because he wrote at least 3 books. One is an authentic narrative. This is about the slave trade. John Newton went away to sea as a young boy on a slave ship, and there he discovered that the slave trade was a very hateful thing to do. He left the slave trade and became an evangelical minister. He came to live at Olney, where Cowpe joined him later on. Cowpe lived with him in his family for a year or so, and then lived with the Unwins for the remaining period at Olney. And there Cowpe wrote the Olney hymns. I would be leaving out something very important if I don't read out this Olney hymn, because it is as simple as some of the poems that I read out this morning for you. God moves in a mysterious way. These hymns are actually read by the people who go to the faithful, who go to the church in England, that is the Anglican Church, the Church of England. So this is one of the poems that they read there quite frequently. So Cowpe is well known to the English people because of these hymns also. He is well known to the English people because of the diverting history of John Gilpin, and he is also well known to the English people because of his hymns. God moves in a mysterious way. God moves in a mysterious way his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. Deep in unfathomable mines of never falling skill, he treasures up his bright designs and works his sovereign will. Ye fearful saints, fresh courage take, the clouds ye so much dread are big with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence he hides a smiling face. Behind a frowning providence he hides a smiling face. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. Olney hymns were written when he was less than 50 years old. Later in his life, because he lived until about 69, 70, later in his life he was very dejected that God did not really exist and he did not come to his aid ever in his life. However, earlier he wrote, behind a frowning providence he hides a smiling face. As you read earlier, the clouds is so much dread are big with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. All this hope gradually vanished as he grew older, and his disease, that is the depression, took over his entire being, as it were. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. Blind unbelief is sure to err and scan his work in vain. God is his own interpreter, and he will make it plain. God is his own interpreter, and he will make it plain. Here is a faithful man who believed so intensely, so passionately in the existence of God. And these Olney hymns, simple, naive hymns, were written in the company of Reverend John Newton. A historian of English literature says that those hymns were contributed to the volume on Cowpe's request. Whatever the case might have been, today Cowpe's hymns are read very passionately by the faithful in England. I was telling you about John Newton, Reverend John Newton, who was a neighbor of and a friend of one of his best friends in life. Cowpe did not have many friends. At Olney and at Huntingdon, the Unwins were his friends, and at Olney he came to know Reverend John Newton, who was his friend, with whom he wrote the Olney hymns. Newton was a curate at Olney, and to Newton he writes about the hare that had run away from his house. The following occurrence he writes on August the 21st, 1780. I am giving you the date so that you might be able to follow it up when you try to fish out some of William Cowper's letters. The following occurrence ought not to be passed over in silence, in a place where so few notable ones are to be met with. Last Wednesday night, while we were at supper, between the hours of 8 and 9, I heard an unusual noise in the back parlour, as if one of the hares was entangled and endeavouring to disengage herself. I was just going to rise from table when it ceased. In about 5 minutes, a voice on the outside of the parlour door inquired if one of my hares had got away. I immediately rushed into the next room and found that my poor favourite puss had made her escape. She had gnawed in sunder the strings of the lattice work with which I thought I had sufficiently secured the window, and which I preferred to any other sort of blind because it admitted plenty of air. From thence I hastened to the kitchen, where I saw the redoubtable Thomas Freeman, who told me that having seen her just after she dropped into the street, he attempted to cover her with his hat, but she screamed out and leaped directly over his head. I then desired him to pursue as fast as possible, and added Richard Coleman to the chase, as being nimbler and carrying less weight than Thomas. Notice the details that he records. They are almost scientific. Remember that the growth and the rise of prose is an important event in the history of any nation. He is writing these lines in the 1780s. 100 years before him, in around the middle of, in the 1660s, let's say, the Royal Society was formed, and Dryden, who was one of the members of the Royal Society, the poet John Dryden, came out with a kind of a prescription for prose writers, that prose should be clear, concise, exact in its details, because it must enable you to see through. It should be like a glass pane which allows you to see through it. You should be able to see through. You should be able to see the object that is being described. And here you find in Cowpe, which is in fact a matter that has influenced many prose writers. Cowpe can be seen as an early example of clear, lucid prose. But this can be seen in many writers, and it is worthy of a moment's thought how a language develops within a nation, within a society. What acts, what events, what decisions, what desires motivate people to write clear, concise prose in any language. Here we are talking about English, which can be thought of in our own languages also. So I was talking about John Newton, a friend late in his life, but we cannot close the account of William Cowpe until we have also talked about his cousin Theodora Cowpe, with whom Cowpe developed a kind of friendship, an intimacy, and a love affair. However, because Theodora was his cousin, she outlived William Cowpe by about more than 2 decades. She died towards the end of the first quarter of the 19th century, if I put it in a roundabout manner. So Theodora and his sister, he was intensely attached to his sister, Harriet, who later became Lady Hesketh, and he has written many letters to Lady Hesketh. Theodora contributed towards his upkeep later in his life because he was not in a position to help himself. Others had to take care of his survival, and Theodora contributed £50 per annum towards his upkeep. He received a grant from the government of England, a grant of some £300 per annum, a gratuity, a pension from the government. But that came too late, just a few years before his demise in 1800 on. So Theodora Theodora, before I conclude, I must remind you once again about this lady Austen, who in one of the periods of his dejection advised him to write on any topic, and she was a great asset to Cowpe. She told him about the sofa. He asked her, what should I write upon? Because there isn't a subject, and Cowpe told her, write on the sofa. The sofa that was lying there was one which had historical significance. It had been used by Charles II, and he wrote a poem which later became the Task. Let me read out a few lines on the sofa that he wrote, which is now lying at the museum, at the Cowpe Museum. Just a second. We will read that poem on some other occasion. So he wrote a poem which later developed into the task, the poem called The Task, about which Cooper was very proud. And this came out of Miss Austen's suggestion about the sofa on which he could write one. Cooper would remain to be one of the great minor poets, and not unjustly he would influence, along with Gray and Collins, the major romantic poets of the 19th century. Thank you.